Hello everyone and welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast. So me again this week, a solo episode. Tune out now if you need to. But before I get started, I just want to encourage you to like the show and follow us on Spotify and do those things, comment and whatever, review us. They raise the podcast up the rankings because we've got a lot of guests to come and we're in no way stopping now. We're just getting started. So it'd be nice to expose ourselves to as wide an audience as interested, as long as you're interested as possible. Anyway, now to get started. Today's podcast is on traditional, non-traditional. So what does tradition mean exactly? Right? Because we have of course we're talking about Ashtanga and we have this thing that often comes up. Well, are you a traditional Ashtangi or not? Right? And neither term I particularly like because essentially tradition is something for us to use. So tradition is from the word transdare, I think trasdare. It's the Italian to carry over. Yeah, to give over, to carry over. So something which is carried over from the old to the new. So a method or a way of working, an attitude, a pattern, right? Something that's worked over time, something that's somewhat trialed and tested, right? So we don't have to start again every time. Sensible, practical, reasonable, right? On the other hand, although we're preserving something that's working and that's worked, of course it's in the past, right? It's something that's in the past and it's framed in its specifics in the past, right? So we need to contextualize that tradition to the modern epoch, to the modern context, to the modern way of working, right? For example, clothing. I mean, it's a silly thing, just comes to my mind. Of course, we have certain traditions in clothing, some ways of making patterns, certain ways of making textiles, but we don't wear the clothes of the 1920s, for example, or maybe we do now because fashion kind of comes in circles, doesn't it? But you see what I mean? Or, for example, cooking, right? Cuisine, French cuisine or Italian cuisine. There's general principles. There's basic culinary techniques. But those dishes change and amend depending on the particular context. So the modern context for, say, French cuisine, which is still very much in essence. I love France, and as you might know, I've spent a lot of time in France. If you look at the way that modern French cooking is evolving, the dishes are lighter, they're not so rich, but they're still using the same culinary techniques as traditional French cuisine has done over the ages, right? But nevertheless, they've evolved to suit the modern specific needs, right? So you see where I'm going with this, perhaps. So yoga as well has evolved. And even if you look at the name Ashtanga Yoga, right? Patabi Joyce's Ashtanga Yoga, not Patanjali's, right? Ashtanga Yoga itself is that epithet, that name that Westerners actually called the yoga that Patabi Joyce taught them, because he didn't call it anything but the yoga for a while, a long time. They just called it the yoga. So they took that because he had named his shala, his basically his front room in his house, Ashtanga Yoga Nilayam, and then latterly Ashtanga Yoga Research Institute. So it was changing, and in the early days, as you know, I've said many times, it was an experiment. I remember asking David Swenson why he asked them to practice twice a day originally, because did you know that? First of all, they had to practice twice a day when they signed up with Patabi Joyce as a requirement for his taking them as a student. Twice a day, morning and evening. And I said to David, why did he do that? Right? And the answer that comes back, as in so many times, well, I think we were just an experiment. Well, and some people worked in that experiment and some people didn't work in that experiment, if you see what I mean. The experiment didn't work for everyone, right? Because I think, as David often says this, they were the guinea pigs, and Patabi Joyce took things out and added things in and amended things depending on what he saw was working or what he saw wasn't working. Yeah? A great example of this was in he took out Parivrtta Parsvakonasana, the long side twist with the hand outside, the twisted side twist with the hand outside the knee. He took that out and then he added it back in again because the students requested, they wanted it, but he said no one can do that posture. Which is still fairly true to today. Right? Make sure you get the arm right outside the knee. Don't worry about the back foot, by the way. Anyway, so going back to the idea of tradition, non-tradition, it's a way of working, a pattern, right? A pattern. So basically the tradition is comprised of general principles, right? A general approach, a general principles approach that needs to be applied in terms of specifics to suit any age. Yeah. And yoga, asana, as well as yoga philosophy even, is context sensitive. Yeah. As we evolve and we have different values, say to 100 years ago even, and not least from 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, completely different value set. the ways of understanding ourselves and of embodying ourselves, they also have to evolve, surely. And even the way of moving, right? It's only in for the last 150 years, say, that we've really embraced dynamic movement culture. Prior to that, it was really a lot more static forms, right? But then in the 1800s, you see the advent of a lot of team sports and a lot of fluid movements. And so even the way that we've learned to move in a more dynamic fashion is a modern one. Yeah. And the same with asana. Before 1900s, again, it was a static tradition. There was no dynamic movements, really. Well, there is the Hatha Yoga Padati that suggests that there might be some dynamic movements, and that's the 1850s or something. But certainly prior to that, asana traditionally has been a static form, yeah, and it's not been dynamic. So, of course, we use it to suit our current needs, and I think that's fairly reasonable in my mind. So, if we extrapolate from there to the modern Ashtanga, well, you see where I'm going again. We again need to be pragmatic, whilst also maintaining an ideal. It's not like I don't feel there's any need for ideal and symbol and somewhat of myth. We're emotional beings more than rational, so we trade in those things. We need a sense of belonging to something greater, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Tradition and pragmatism can go together. I don't think that a rational mind, can only tolerate one answer, so one thing is right and one thing is wrong. But we're more than the rational mind. We can tolerate paradox. We can tolerate tradition and non-tradition at the same time. Yeah, we're not a binary machine. The mind might be binary, but ourselves as a spirit, we're not binary at all, in fact. Anyway, carrying on. So each generation is tasked with reinterpreting the traditions, let's say. And I think we've seen that even in the modern Ashtanga tradition. And as we know now, it's definitely a modern tradition. The Yoga Kurunta has never been seen, and it seems increasingly unlikely. So the sequences must be said to have evolved from Patabi Joyce and then have been interpreted and added to over the years, in terms of not necessarily added to by the students, but certainly interpreted a great deal by the particular students that came back to the West or the East, but came out of Mysore, having been taught by Patabi Joyce, and added their interpretation upon it. So we get extra things like a full vinyasa. People like John Scott and Lino, I don't think Patabi Joyce ever taught full vinyasa, as far as I know, for example. And then other stylistic ideas. Yeah, as you well know, you go to one Ashtanga teacher and they will say one thing is tradition. Another Ashtanga teacher, as you know, will say another thing is tradition. So it's a bit like Chinese whispers. I can't say that these days, can I? There must be another word for it. When you go to somewhere and everyone gets a different answer, right? And then they pass it on and it gets gradually different. Yeah? Anyway, moving on from my inappropriate comment. Apologies, everyone. So the question is, how do we apply general traditional aspects to specifics, right? So the general ideas are a pattern, right? And Krishnamacharya first comes up with a general pattern, right? So the idea of vinyasa, right? This idea of a pattern, a special placement, vinyasa, special placement. And to be honest, as I've said before in the podcast, Krishnamacharya is the first person to come up with this usage of vinyasa, although vinyasa is used for mudra and particular in ritual mudras. It's not used in yoga asana. And Krishnamacharya innovates, right? He's innovative, but he's also innovating within tradition. So again, he himself, what he's doing is using tradition and applying it to a modern context. He's using asanas. There's record of many of the asanas he taught in past traditions. There's obviously record of the kind of approach that he's using, right? When you read the Makaranda, he's referencing Yoga Sutras a great deal, for example, and other tantric texts. So he's kind of using tradition, but again, innovating. He's using it and making it specific to the needs of the current population. So he made it dynamic. Right? Before Krishnamacharya, certainly there's these records of a couple of texts, the Sri Tapaniti and the Yoga Abhyasa Padati in the Mysore library, that suggest that there's a moving form, but they're not. No one's actually done that before people like Krishnamacharya. And at a similar time, Sri Yogendra innovates as well and makes it dynamic, and Kavalananda, Swami Kavalananda at the Yoga Kavalyadam ashram in Lonavala is also making dynamic system, but they're all innovating using traditional yoga and making it appropriate to the needs of the modern context. And of course, Krishnamacharya carries on doing that because he uses his yoga to teach the young boys, which is what the Maharaj of Mysore asked him originally. Teach these young boys between 12 and 18 or such to do some yoga and to get strong and fit and keep their mind occupied. So for teenage boys, it needs to be something quite snappy, quite dynamic, right? As we know. So we all know if we have teenage boys, or if you've been a teenage boy or girl, in fact, so you need to be occupied and you're quite physical and able. And nevertheless, when Krishnamacharya moves on and he goes to Chennai and he starts teaching adults, he never teaches that way. He's using the tradition and suiting it to the current audience. So I think we take Krishnamacharya as a precedent. We don't have to feel guilty if we are seen to adapt our Ashtanga method from what we might have learnt in Mysore or what even we might practice to suit the specific audience. Yeah, like I've said many times before, I had this crisis of conscience when I was going to Mysore every year, and like a good Mysore student, a good Ashtangi. Again, not my favourite term, but a good Ashtangi. I was going to Mysore for my 3 months a year for a number of years, working my way through the series there. And coming back and wanting to teach it exactly as I'd been taught, because that was what we were always told. But then I got to the City of London, right? And I was teaching a Mysore in the City of London for many years. And at that point, there's loads of bankers there. There's loads of men and women, bankers, stiff, sitting at a desk all day. They can't do this stuff. Break their knees. I'd have to stop them at the first sun salutation if I had to get it perfect, right? So then you have to adapt. So then you have to look, and this is where my teaching really developed or changed perhaps, is like, well, what are we actually teaching? Well, there's certain general principles, right? There's certain general principles, and you could say that's wrapped up in the Trishtana, Pattabhi Jois's Trishtana, which, again, is Pattabhi Jois's innovation from tradition, because no one's mentioned the Trishtana before Pattabhi Jois. But nevertheless, we have this idea of breath, bandha, drishti, or posture, bandha and drishti. Yeah. So we're teaching kind of like a general way of holding the body, and then a general way of breathing. Yeah. And then the usage of the neck in the way of drishti. And then, well, some people suggest, and it's a more recent interesting thing, usage of an attitude in drishti as well. Drishti could be seen as a kind of attitude towards practice. The idea of abhyasa vairagya, of effort but non-effort at the same time. So of cultivating this attitude of kind of dynamic detachment as well, which comes over time. So, there's many things going on in the practice, but none of them are specifics around taking a toe or folding forward in this particular manner with a flat back, or these little things, right? Whether you pull the leg up, whether you put it down, right? All those specifics that have come and crept into Ashtanga, particularly now, modern Ashtanga, has become more homogenized now. They never were originally so. It wasn't so rigid originally, but that's another conversation perhaps as to why it's become more rigid. What we're looking at is like, if we're trying to make people appreciate the method, yeah, then we have to get them where they're at, right? Because there's no point teaching them exactly how it should be in the modern sense if they can't understand that. So it only makes sense to pragmatize and apply specifics of a general method from person to person, as they can appreciate and enjoy it, and worry about the small print later, as I often say. Worry about the small details later, whether they're catching the toe with this finger or that finger, taking the side of the foot, taking the top of the foot, all the little things that in Mysore people concentrate on. Don't worry about that first. Just get them interested, get them involved, get them, or for yourself, first of all, enjoy the practice. Do as many postures as you can, because just doing a little bit of primary series, if you're doing it as a modern movement modality, right, which is also let's say a modern innovation in yoga, to use it as a form of somewhat exercise, or physical therapy, yeah, that is also a modern idea. But if you're using it like that, you need to do more than just a few primary series postures. There's hardly any forms. There's not much of a variation of movement forms in there, right? Anyway, going back to the idea again. So Joyce was innovating as much as Krishnamacharya. As we said, Krishnamacharya comes up with this kind of general idea, that yoga asana can be a bona fide spiritual practice, and he trades on the precedent of tantric yoga. But yet, tantric yoga is very specific in trying to raise kundalini, and Krishnamacharya is kind of using, for the first time, in fact, a kind of yoga in a softer way. So he's synthesizing it with Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, like for mind control and for stability and for one-pointed focus. These aren't in tantric yoga. So essentially he's taking two traditions and merging them so the general person can do them, right? You don't have to be a yogi in a cave trying to raise your kundalini, or a monk, trying to still the mind, Chittavritti, Nirodharas and Patanjali. You can do these in such a way that you can embody your body, but still do it in a spiritual sense. So there's a kind of the idea of personal transformation, which is much more pragmatic. In the first place, Krishnamacharya is much more pragmatic. Right? He's taking normal people and trying to get them to use yoga for the sake of life, really, right? For the sake of living in life and understanding something deeper in life, not exiting life, not escaping life, which is pretty much the general president of yoga before 1900s, using yoga to transcend the life of suffering. Yeah? Life is seen as suffering, yeah, whether we agree with it or not. And perhaps now we say, well, life is maybe not as harsh now. There's many modern aspects of technology which has made life, for many of us, more pleasant, not so difficult. And so maybe we could also say that has changed our view to yoga. We're not necessarily looking to transcend life anymore, but use it, embrace it, yeah, work with it, not against it, not hold ourselves in stasis, in a steady posture against it, but flow with it, engage our bodies in relation to life in a dynamic movement. So you can see there that the context of the yoga has also shifted into dynamic from static to reflect the modern interest in the way that we look at life, the way that we want to engage with life. Okay, so Joyce again was innovating, right? Because he applied the series, right, to adult bodies. Krishnamacharya came up with different patterns, I think, and suggested different asanas to the kids, right? But it wasn't. He wasn't teaching the series. That's Pattabhi Joyce, and somehow from Krishnamacharya to Pattabhi Joyce, we get these series, yeah. And Pattabhi Joyce taught the series to adult bodies, and as we know, Krishnamacharya was teaching these young kids. So again, Pattabhi Joyce is seeing, like, as an experiment, well, can I apply this modern dynamic movement form that really was, is very, very dynamic and very, very extreme in terms of the flexibility that it's asking. Can I apply this to adult bodies now and see how far we can go? See how far we can take these adult Western bodies? Because before the Westerners came, he was teaching the Indians, but they weren't really doing the yoga in a dynamic way, according to people like David Williams, who was there to see it. And even if you saw Pattabhi Joyce or Sharat teaching the Indians in the afternoons of Mysore, he was teaching them in a much more gentle way. You were not pushing them to do intense back bends, not getting them to catch their ankles in back bends and walking their hands up, So it was a kind of experiment. Again, tradition, a way of working, and then using tradition as a way of working to render specifics depending on the particular context. So the problem is when the finger comes to be taken for the moon. So when the specifics come to be taken for the thing itself, right? So when the specifics of the modern Ashtanga style, like whether you're practicing the whole series or back bending, catching a ankle, trying to think of the specifics of the particular Mysore etiquette, the things you have to do to prove that you're in the Mysore club. Nothing's coming particularly to mind. Probably you help me out better now, right? But the specifics of Ashtanga tradition, right? No, you do it like that. No, the back foot has to be 90 degrees. No, the hands have to be together. No, the fingers have to be together, not just the hands, right? All these little things. No, in Ardha Baddha Padma Paschimottanasana, don't take the toe, don't take the hand over the foot, touch the side of the foot. No, you should take the wrist, not the hands. The hands shouldn't take the foot, the wrist. You should catch the wrist. All these things, right? No, you can't do second series back bends that are much more therapeutic for the back. Shalabhasana, Dhanurasana, Ustrasana before you do back bends. You can't do that. No, you can't stand up. You can't do second series before you stand up from back bends. So I'm getting carried away now. Okay, they come thick and fast now. So you can see there's a certain politic here. Okay? So specifics of interpretation, which were logistically used by the Joyce family, because when too many people started to come, it kind of got a bit crazy there, and they had to make more general rules to govern. Yeah, have been taken as the tradition itself. Yeah, which they're not. I mean, the tradition itself is about these general principles of moving, and the series are used to help people with a general way of moving. And you might or might not know, in the end, when people had completed the original series with Joyce, the first 4 series, they were given their own series, the Rishi series. Yeah. 15 or so postures that they held in static form, yeah, not moving, yeah. So, we've come to the place where we've somewhat fetishized certain details of the Ashtanga sequence. So if you don't do the sequence exactly, if you skip a posture or you amend a posture, modify it, yeah, or you don't practice your whole practice every time, or you practice on a moon day, or you don't practice 6 days a week, yeah, then you're not going to get the benefit, yeah, because that's the tradition. If you don't follow the tradition, then then you haven't. Basically, then the magic spell won't work. That's the bottom line, right? That's the idea. The tradition has been taken as a kind of mystique, as a ritual, as a magic ritual, yeah, because it's been taken in the specific sense, not as in the general principles, right? So again, this is not necessarily our fault, because people do that, in order to take the general principles, take the tradition outside the individual's control. Yeah. So do you understand that idea? That what happens is the established order, right? So teachers in this capacity, in this capacity, Ashtanga teachers will take the tradition outside the individual's control. So they no longer can work with it specifically. They have to go to the teacher to understand the tradition. Yeah, because if it's general principles, right? If it's general principles, those can be taught, and then the individual is empowered in the tradition. But if it's about specifics, and increasingly those specifics get complicated and complicated, so the individual isn't in charge of the ritual, isn't in charge of the tradition, because they need to understand the specifics, which are very complicated, from the teacher. So then they need the teacher, and they're disempowered by tradition, which has always been the case throughout the ages. Look at religion. First of all, it's a way of working. I liked my first religious studies teacher in college said tradition means is coming from the idea of religare, religion, religare, and he called it a mistranslation really, but he said this means a way of walking. It actually means a relinking. Yeah, but I liked the way of walking, like an attitude. Tradition is an attitude or a pattern, a subtle pattern to the world. Yeah, a subtle approach to French cooking. I always think of a subtle approach to how you do things based on very general principles and gradually expanding upon them. Yeah, you take butter generally as a starting point, French cuisine, and then you add garlic and onions. Yeah, right. And flour to make a roux. Anyway, I was cooking for a previous life. So the same with Ashtanga, right? You take these general principles, right? You've got breath, you've got a use of certain locks of the body, and you gradually expand them outwards. But then when you're going to specifics, like these sequences, right, are very specifics of a tradition for a particular age and for a particular type of person. To make the tradition work for the particular type of person in my sort of time, the young boys, it was applied specifically. But that doesn't mean it was relevant to us. We use the tradition, Krishnamacharya's tradition, and maybe we like the series is still, and I'll come back to this at the end of why the modern Ashtanga tradition is still relevant, but we have to apply it pragmatically, right? And not take the thing in itself as the tradition, but the general principles behind the thing in itself. Otherwise, again, I like this idea a lot, we fetishize the thing. No, catching the big toe is about energy. Yeah, you catch the big toe and you bind, you make a connection with the energy, right? If you take left foot into lotus first, then you've broken the energy, right? All this kind of stuff, right? So it's fetishizing the way of doing things and specifics, yeah? That they have value in and of itself, rather than the practicalities of, okay, there's a general pattern that's been effective. There's a general pattern that's been effective over the ages, tried and tested by a number of people. And in order not to have to start that all over again, we can take as a springboard to application to them in the modern sense. Yeah. But yet again, in every age, in the tradition or the religion, yeah, or any tradition, unfortunately, as beings, we seem to have this confusing need to control each other. So there's always a group in power. There's always an established power, because power comes into any vacuum. Yeah, so there'll always be a group in power, and they take tradition and religion and order, and they establish it and control it. Right. So that's what, to take it out of individuals' hands. That's what they're doing. So say, well, you can't understand tradition, right? You need us to understand tradition, and then you need us, and you'll pay us, and you'll submit to us, right? You see where I'm going with this? So it's not to say that there isn't a need to follow a method, right? And we look at that very clearly in the Bhagavad Gita, which constantly emphasizes, no, you need to do the rituals, you need to do the method. But on the other hand, once you've understood the method, I love a quote in the Bhagavad Gita where they say something like, as useless as a well when the land is inundated with water. That's as useless as the Vedas are to the one that knows the truth. Something like that, right? Yeah. Third or fourth chapter. Yeah. And it's a few things that he says like that. Well, the author says like that, right? It's just, you need to finally take that method and make it your own. And there's many that will try and take that out of your hands, right? And say, no, if you don't get it exactly right in this order, to do with specifics, the whole tradition is spoiled and you can't call yourself traditional. And I say the opposite. I say that's certainly not the case, right? That's the purposeful obfuscation. It means obfuscation is a posh word for confusion or mystifying, the purposeful mystification of tradition. No, we can't understand tradition. It's deeper than us. And again, this is just pure superstition again. We're back to the superstition of the ritual Vedas, or the ritual religion, of doing a spell, doing a magic spell, and hoping for some benefit from doing that spell right, right? From a higher power. If I do everything right and I practice for a period of time, the gates will be unlocked, the magic combination lock will be unlocked, and I'll get some kind of enlightenment. No, you won't. It's a pattern, and it has to have effective results. The tradition is only as good as its results, and you're able to judge the results, like on a daily level, and you're able to work personally with tradition, I think, on a daily level. Okay? But yeah, this is often skipped over in modern Ashtanga because modern teaching is a business, and teachers want students, and in an increasingly competitive marketplace, the teacher will come back and say, well, I've been to Mysore, or I know the Mysore tradition, and therefore I'm the only one qualified to pass on this tradition to the students because I know the specifics. Yeah? And again, that idea of making things complicated. So you need to go to the teacher to understand the specifics. No, in Prasarita, if you raise the hands up on exhale, no. But it's simple. The vinyasa is a simple thing. Inhale is expansion, exhale is a flexion or a contractive movement. Yeah? That's always what it is. If you look at the Makaranda, Krishnamacharya does different counts because he's not teaching the sequences, and that's basic principle of his vinyasa. Expand is an inhale, contract is an exhale. Right? So basic principles, not specifics, right? So yeah. Tradition isn't magic, but on the other hand, to finalize, to conclude, to end this podcast, it does still mean something. As I said, we're emotional beings. We're not rational, really. I think we trade in symbol, myth, and some kind of inner landscape as much as we have to relate to each other in a somewhat rational form to convey our ideas. On the inside of us, I don't think that's the way we operate. And we need a sense of belonging. We need a sense of stability. We need to find a group identity. We need to find a way of relating the inside to the outside in a way that makes sense, in a way that it feels right. And the modern Ashtanga tradition can help us do that. Yeah. But I think the problem is when the tradition is taken too homogeneously, too rigidly, too censoriously, in other words, criticizing other people, right? You're in, you're out, right? To make a kind of, and to use a term that Elizabeth D. Michaelis uses when she talks in her book, which is the precursor to Mark Singleton's book. You should read Elizabeth's book. She talks about esotericism, hard word to pronounce, sorry. And the modern esotericism is like trying to make something kind of mystical and then trying to make a kind of initiated few into this group of mysticism, right? So we see where we're going with the esoterization. Is that so? It is esoterization of Ashtanga Yoga, right? So a few initiated into this mystical traditional, right? And I think I'm kind of split in two halves about this in some respects, because as much as I've argued for pragmatism against this, right, you should be able to understand what you're doing and you should be in control of the process. On the other hand, there's something also important about giving oneself over to a certain degree to something bigger than oneself. Yep. Doesn't mean you have to give your autonomy over. So I think we have to be very careful here, not giving ourselves completely over to the guru, because we've seen what happened about that. It didn't go well. But on the other hand, giving us certain sense of our jurisdiction over to being part of something greater, to letting go of the individual self and embracing a transpersonal self, a bigger sense of self, right? Which can, I think, be engendered certainly in things like the lead class or even the Mysore class, and practicing a similar set of movements, a repeated set of movements, which wouldn't be the same if it wasn't a repeated set of movements, right? We wouldn't have the same Ashtanga. We could say we're doing self-practice, but we wouldn't have the same collective identity, but we're all essentially doing the same thing that we didn't choose. None of us chose to do this thing. Yeah, that's important too, right? None of us chose this sequence. It doesn't work perfectly for any of us, but we're all trying to relate to it together. Yeah, we're all trying to relate to it. And, some people struggle with one thing, some people struggle with another thing, but we're all doing the same thing. Yeah. So we're giving ourselves a certain degree of personal autonomy over here to being part of a collective, something greater. Yeah. But then on the negative side, then you get this kind of wish to make a little niche or initiated few that then in control of the body of knowledge and can then legislate on whether people are in or out of the fold. right? Which I've experienced myself in recent years, talking like this, in terms of being not a traditional. In for those people that go to my source still and are doing that, I'm not a traditional teacher because even I'm talking about it in a certain sense, even I'm saying these kind of things, right? So I also want to still emphasize, though, not to try and ingratiate myself to those traditional Ashtangis, right? But nevertheless, the importance of the Ashtanga tradition. It's a modern tradition, but tradition isn't valued necessarily by how old it is, but by how effective it is. Yeah, there's many modern things that can be called tradition. If something works over 2 generations, yeah, I would say it's a tradition. It's a way of doing things. We even have family traditions, right? Where we do certain things that have worked before. Yeah. If you're repeating an action because it's worked and it demands a certain sense of focus and a certain sense of getting a certain order or pattern, right? It's a tradition, right? That's all. Yeah. And it can be venerated in as much as it's affected. But as long as it's not effective anymore, then it can be slightly discarded or amended, because the thing in itself, right? Going to the movies on a Saturday afternoon in winter being a modern family tradition, for example, when it no longer works, when it's boring, when something changes, when we get too old or whatever to go to the kids' pictures in the morning, whatever, then that tradition has to be amended, right? There has to be, the general principle is time spent with family, time connecting, right? But obviously that's a general principle, and when kids get older, those traditions change, right? Anyway, going back to the modern Ashtanga tradition, yes, we can look at it cynically. Yes, we can say that it can be leveraged for teachers' own ends, right? For control of students, for their own their own ends, and those are the same over the ages, right? Money, fame, and power. But nevertheless, there's still benefits, right? It's a pattern that works all right. It's a pattern that's been tested enough and has some. And the series work all right. I'm not about to create a better one, right? So maybe I should shut up now. They're all right. They're not perfect, but they work okay. And then obviously, as I've mentioned, that sense of belonging gives a sense of belonging to something bigger than oneself, and a sense of support. Over the ages, spiritual traditions have all used a sangha, a community. That's always been absolutely fundamental in any tradition, because you're doing something which is not exactly flowing with the tide of the world. The flowing with the tide of the world is trying to close down awareness, basically. You'll see this in the normal, let's say, not judging pejoratively, not judging negatively, but in normal life for people, which is their world outside, materiality, looking to buy more stuff and looking to close down awareness by use of distractions or even alcohol and other deviations, right? To try and forget, right? I would say that's, and maybe I'm being harsh here, I would say that, normal life in inverted commas is the wish to distract and forget and close down awareness. And what we're doing is something very specific. So we could say we're flowing against the tide in yoga, is we're trying to take those distractions away. Yeah, we're trying not to use crutches. We're trying to see things as they are. We're trying to go towards the comfortable aspect of self, which is uncomfortable because it's conflicted with all kinds of past emotions and thoughts and desires inside. That's why we don't want to go inside, because we've built up all these desires and emotions inside. It's a painful place, but if we don't look at it, it becomes more and more difficult to look at it. Anyways, that's another podcast again. Nevertheless, you see, so we're going towards awareness, and we can say we're flowing against the natural tide of modern society and trying to go towards and not away from awareness, right? So we need a support in that. We need a sangha. We need people that are doing that with us, right? Because we're not living a normal life in most practical terms. Yeah, we're not going to bed at 12 or 1 after a few drinks and a nice dinner and all that stuff. We're going to bed early. We're getting up to practice early, probably. Or at least we're looking carefully at our choices. Our choices in daily life to enable us to practice. To do something like this is you need a disciplined life, right? Which means a disciplined life is always to see things more clearly, right? So so we need to be supported in this by other people of like-mindedness. Yeah. So as I say, the tradition is useful, and belonging to something. Even a modern tradition doesn't need to be 5,000 years old. Doesn't need to be around the Yoga Karunta, right? Everything seems to be 5,000 years old when it's old, by the way, doesn't it? I think the Karunta was meant to be over 1,000 years anyway. But, it doesn't need all those things. It's still valid. It still works. It's still belonging. There's still many generations, from the years of David Williams and David Swenson in the 70s, and Maui and Danny Paradise and all those guys that were doing their thing and developing the spirit of Ashtanga Yoga, then to Tim Miller and that generation, to Eddie Stern and that generation, right? And John Scott. And you see, and there's all these kind of different epochs of when they taught, like Derek Island teaching in Crete, and all the teachers that would go and see him there, and them then coming back and then teaching their students. There's this whole lineage and tradition there, but it's useful. Yeah, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Yeah, but on the other hand, you also have to say that we have to be careful with tradition, and whilst being somewhat idealistic about it. Yep, I don't want to be completely pragmatic. Yep, we need to have this sense of belonging to something good, something that has a power to it. Yeah, it brings the most of us, brings the most out of us. Yeah, but on the other hand, we have to keep a sense of healthy critical thinking about what we're doing. Does it work for us? Is it working for us? And we should be able to see whether it is or isn't working for us in the most practical sense. Yeah, it's not a magic. It's not superstition we're doing here. General principles apply to specifics. So I think I've covered a few things, and in the most pragmatic level, we can say that the modern Ashtanga tradition has also, in terms of the asanas themselves, there's many examples of it evolving over the years, right? I mean, potentially the most greater amendment, the most greater evolution is this 5 breaths from 10 breaths. Originally it was 10 breaths, and now it's only 5 breaths in every asana. And that, to me, in and of itself, is a huge differentiation, right? And then obviously the different spirit that we had in the early years it was allowance and encouragement of people to do more postures, and now it's perfectionism and not being able to move on to the next posture unless you can't complete perfectly the last posture. But I think again that's taking the specifics too literally, whereas we're looking at general principles of awareness. And once someone's grasped the idea of vinyasa, starting and stopping a posture with awareness and building up incrementally in a methodical manner, even if they can't do a posture perfectly, as long as they're not 22 and very able, and it's just simply that they need a month or so to work it out, I'm going to give them more postures, and gradually they pull the whole thing together. Yeah, it's like making a portrait. You colour in the background and then you put the details in. You don't start on the nose and then just get stuck. You make a rough outline of the whole face and the body, upper body, and then gradually you put the details in. The same way, I would say, in terms of approaching the sequences. Yeah, methodically but pragmatically. Well, they kind of go together, don't they? Anyway, I hope that helps a little bit, and I think maybe you get where I'm coming from in terms of the idea of keeping the two, the ideal and the pragmatic. And I think if we're not looking at it rationally, I think we can do the two. So, as I said, if you like any aspect of the talk, then feel free to comment or like the podcast or whatever. And if I haven't seen you already, I'd love to meet you. Come and join me in a workshop or a retreat somewhere. I'm teaching a few retreats. One in Malaga in Christmas will be a really fun one. Over Christmas it is. And then the next retreat is in Italy, in Yoga in Salento. That's in September. I'd love to see you there. Or Alicante, actually. That's in August, in fact. Sorry. August is Turkey, Alicante, and September is Italy. Otherwise, I might be coming to your city soon for a workshop, or if you want me to come to your city at some point for a workshop, then just get in touch. It might be possible, not this year, but next year. All right? So that's me for now, and I'll return next week, hopefully with a more sensible guest than just me. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.